Welcome back to lecture number 30. Today we are focusing on two historical topics. That's the development of an American culture and the Second Great Awakening. The theme for both of these topics is going to be American and regional culture. So let's begin with the first learning objective. That's explain how and why a new national culture developed from 1800 to 1848. So this new national culture emerged and it was a combination of American elements, European influences, and regional cultural sensibility. So for the American elements, we see a lot of the nationalism and the patriotism that came about after the War of 1812. A lot of the paintings that you see that we'll talk about that show daily life in America are really trying to elevate the common person, the common man. And you can see a picture here of a 4th of July celebration. Showing the pride that goes into being an American. Now, for European influences, this same time period, Europe is experiencing the Romanticism movement. And the Transcendentalism movement and the Romanticism movement in Europe are going to be very similar. The art is going to be very similar, the literature, philosophy. And also in the United States, some of the new architecture is going to draw on old European elements. The regional cultural sensibilities, that refers to the frontier culture. So in the frontier, culture is going to be most different than Europe, and it's going to be more American, more unique. So Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, seen down on the bottom left and the bottom right, are good examples of that frontier culture of mountain men in West Virginia and so forth. Now, liberal social ideas from abroad and romantic beliefs in human perfectibility influenced literature, arts, philosophy, and architecture. So the name of the movement that you have to know for this period in terms of culture is Transcendentalism. So this is a movement that's focusing on feeling, intuition, individualism, heroism, and nature. This is distinctly different than the previous overall cultural movement of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was much more about rational thought and logic and giving up individual rights for the greater good of the whole. So remember John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. That's when people are giving up some of their rights so that they can have the protections of a larger government. With Transcendentalism, we are focused much more on the individual. So this philosophy is going to be put forth by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and Henry David Thoreau. Their ideas of self-reliance by Emerson, picking yourself up by the bootstraps and relying on yourself. And Henry David Thoreau, he had a 2-year experiment in Massachusetts, living out in the wilderness next to Walden Pond. He wrote the book Walden on his thoughts and his experiences from that experiment of living by himself. He also believed that the Mexican-American War that was being fought in the 1840s was immoral, and so therefore he stopped paying taxes. He was put in jail, and he wrote an essay called On Civil Disobedience, which will become important again once we get into the 20th century and we start talking about protests. And so this idealist view of how the world should be and the individual's place in the world is going to be central to the Transcendentalist movement. For literature, we have Washington Irving and Nathaniel Hawthorne. They wrote The Legend of Sleeping Hollow and The Scarlet Letter. So The Scarlet Letter is looking at the Puritan culture in the early 1600s and really starting to identify some of the inconsistencies of that culture, with Hester Prynne being accused of infidelity, having to wear that scarlet A. As far as art goes, we start to see paintings or new American style of paintings with landscape. So the Hudson River School outside of New York, or outside of New York City, there are artists that are painting these huge dramatic landscapes that are showing the beauty of the United States, and also artists like John James Audubon, who are focusing on the natural elements of the United States. So his big focus was birds, and to this day, one of the largest bird conservancy organizations in the world is named after John James Audubon. That's the Audubon Society. And we also see a new style of painting called genre paintings that are looking at ordinary life. We've already talked about George Caleb Bingham and his paintings about the election process, stump speaking, the county election, and then the announcing of the results. And then, like I said, architecture, the federal and private buildings are going to borrow Greek style. So the Greek columns that you see outside of federal buildings and even banks and some mansions, that will be borrowed from Europe. All right, moving on to the next learning objective. We're going to talk about the causes of the Second Great Awakening. So to begin, the Second Great Awakening was a religious revival of many Christian denominations and creations of new ones. So we'll see Mormons and Millerites be some of these new denominations. The revivals consisted of thousands of followers. They were sometimes held in rural areas as camp meetings. So that's what it was. Now for the actual causes, what the key concept says is that the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, a response to rationalism, and changes to society caused by the market revolution, along with greater social and geographical mobility, contributed to a Second Great Awakening among Protestants. So let's start with those first two causes. The first one, democratic and individual beliefs. Worshippers, they are attracted to a less formal, more participatory service in which it feels like everyone is equal and everyone's participation is important. So one of the preachers that had these kinds of camp meetings out in the rural areas where anyone could come was Timothy Wright. He was also a former president of Yale University. Then for response to rationalism, we see that new services are focused more on emotion and experience of salvation as opposed to the logic and the theology. It's more about the experience of the individual. Methodist preacher Peter Cartwright was another one of those preachers that really focused on the individual's emotion. Notice how there is a similarity here between Transcendentalism focusing on the individual, as is the Second Great Awakening focusing on the individual religious experience. And then for the last two causes, the effects of the market revolution, we see that there is a reaction to the growing materialism and sin associated with greed. Also, everyone is spending their time out working. So you see in the top picture, people coming and going from the factories to their houses. They're looking a lot less energetic. They feel like they are only devoting their entire life to work in the pursuit of money. And so that was seen as sinful. And so that needed to change. That these Protestant preachers were calling them out for devoting so much of their time and their thoughts to getting more money. And then finally, social and geographical mobility. Just as people thought that they could or saw that they could move up economically through different generations, they saw that through hard work and devotion, they could also attain salvation. And then Charles Grandison Finney is probably the most important of the preachers that is mentioned over here, and he was popular in New York. And then all of the counties that you see here in the state of New York were referred to him as the burnt over district because a lot of his sermons consisted of people being warned about the imminent hell if they do not change their ways, their sinful ways, and repent. That's why they refer to that area as the burnt over district. All right, so a quick recap on all of this. We have new culture based on nationalism and patriotism. We have transcendentalism seen across art, literature, philosophy, and architecture. The Great Awakening is another religious revival reinforcing Calvinist ideas and creating new denominations similar to the First Great Awakening in the 18th century. And finally, the causes for the Second Great Awakening were the market revolution, the growing middle class, democratic sentiment, and a response to rationalism. That is it for this lecture. Thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next one.